Happening now, Georgia's House of Representatives holding a hearing to discuss the voting process in Georgia, and President Trump's legal team is part of it. This all comes after a state Senate hearing last week at the state capitol to discuss allegations of voting irregularities in the presidential election. Maura Sirianni has more.
Ahead of January's runoff election, members of the Georgia House are working to make sure every vote in the state is counted and counted legally. This morning, the Georgia House of Representatives met via Zoom after having spent much of its 2020 legislative session discussing election laws. House Speaker David Ralston and House Governmental Affairs Committee Chairman Shaw Blackman say the focus of the committee's work today is to ensure the security and efficiency of the upcoming U.S. Senate runoff and other future elections. This morning, the House heard testimony on the topic of the validity of absentee ballots. That testimony raising serious questions about the legality of the Secretary of State's decision to send out unsolicited mail-in ballot applications without legislative input or oversight.
It's clear something went wrong. Numerous reports of potential problems and failures in the general election in November have been alleged, some of them quite serious. And we intend to get to the bottom of it.
And state elections officials maintain there is still no evidence of systemic voter fraud.